In this section of our talk on the politics of poverty, we'll look at why some countries are in fact poor. There are a large number of theories put forward by various people, and I'm going to look at some of these, some of them in more detail than others, shown on this slide. So there's aspects of geography which we'll look at. Some people would say that it's the history of colonization that has kept Africa in particular poor. There are others who put this down to poor governance, corruption, and so on. There's something called the resource curse, which I'll come on to, and there are aspects of culture that we'll do briefly. So, just to set the scene again, on the slide you see the relative growth rates of various different parts of the world, and what you can see is where growth took off in Europe around 1800 or so. The rest of the world has followed similar upward trajectory, but with growth taking off rather later, and in some cases sufficiently late that those parts of the world are a long way behind the developed parts of the Western world and its offshoots. Here's one explanation by Jared Diamond of why some countries are poorer than others. And it's part of what's called geographical determinism. In other words, that our history depends upon our geography. So agriculture, which is essential to the development of civilization, because it can support a larger population, began in what's called the Fertile Crescent down there in what's now the Middle East, and spread to Africa gradually and to Europe, and originated again independently in South America. The spreading of agriculture was much easier on an east-west axis than on a north-south axis, as the next slide shows, because climates tend to be similar on an east-west axis and very different on a north-south axis. And so the sort of crops that you can grow, the sort of livestock you can domesticate, are very different as you go from the south of Africa to the north of Africa, whereas they're very similar as you go from the east of Europe to the west of Europe. And you have similar issues of transmission in the Americas. So that those countries that became rich were those that could develop agriculture in the temperate zones. And the Fertile Crescent and the other areas of the origin of agriculture lost their first mover advantage and didn't develop so rapidly. That's one version of geographical determinism. Here's another version due to Jeffrey Sachs, which is that if you're close to the sea, you have an advantage in trade, and an advantage in trade translates to an advantage in growth of wealth and development. The reason being that trade enables people to exploit the areas in which they have an advantage, and if two people are both exploiting areas in which they have a competitive advantage, then by trading they're both richer than if they both try and do everything themselves. And so industrialization and the growth of wealth tends to spread to countries that are near ports. And it is true that many of the landlocked countries of Africa today are in fact the poorest countries, with poor transport links and poor links to trade with the outside world, and they can only trade with their equally poor neighbours, which is of no advantage to them. So that's geographical determinism. A lot of people would say that that's not the whole story, or not even part of the story. that more important is to look at the part of the world that was colonized by Europe over the centuries, and that means almost the whole of the world outside Europe. So on this map, we've got various colours representing the different areas colonized by different European countries. And what you notice is that most of the map, apart from Europe itself, is coloured. In other words, most of the world was colonized at one time or another by European powers. And the argument is that the European powers had very little interest in developing their colonial possessions other than to exploit their natural resources. And so that while Europe grew rich as a result of colonization, the rest of the world remained poor. Well, one can argue whether that is a fair interpretation of the British imperial legacy or any other continental European legacy, but that's one proposal for the origin of the problems of parts of the world. In the next slide, we see the arguments put forward by Acemoglu that it's really governance, it's really corruption, it's really the abilities of institutions to deliver social benefits as opposed to capturing the benefits of the elite for themselves that leads to growth and prosperity. And the argument here is developed by looking at parts of the world which have exactly the same geographical, ethnic environment, and looking to see that where they are divided in terms of governance, there are large differences. There's a town called Nogales in Arizona, which is also a town in Mexico because the border runs through the middle of the town. And the American side, it's not so clear on these photographs that I've tried to put together here, but if you look very closely, the American side is prosperous, well-governed, functioning civil community. The Mexican side, less so. So you have exactly the same conditions. The only difference is governance. On one side you get European levels, American levels of wealth. On the other side you get much lower levels of income. And the slide that's most famous for showing this is the one on the right, which is Korea at night, where the democratic government of South Korea developed free market economy, developed industrially in about 50 years from absolute poverty to approaching high-income countries' levels of wealth. And you see that by the electricity illuminating the country at night. Whereas in North Korea, just to the north, the totalitarian regime has failed to develop the country because it benefits the small elite rather than the population at large. And Acemoglu and Robinson summarise this. I won't go through all the details on this slide, but by distinguishing between what they call extractive institutions, that's to say structures in politics, taxation, government spending and so on, subsidies, that just favour the wealthy elite, and compared to inclusive institutions which establish a rule of law under which everyone is equal, respect property rights, respect intellectual rights, have an independent judicial system, have free elections and so on. So it's the distinction between extractive institutions on the one hand, where the benefits of the country go to the wealthy elite, compared to inclusive institutions on the other hand, that in the view of this theory is the origin of these discrepancies in wealth between nations. And if we look just very briefly at a picture of where natural resources are in the world. The countries with the most natural resources are those coloured yellow. The country with some natural resources are coloured that sort of muddy colour. If we then look at the next slide, shows us where the wealthy countries are, it's not those with the most natural resources, because a lot of the income, what economists call a lot of the rents from those natural resources, have not benefited the population in the context of the way their governments operate. So we've covered most of these theories. I'll mention briefly the ones that I haven't grayed out here, which I haven't talked about so far. We have climate and disease. Well, climates of the world are very different. If you go to many parts of Africa, then malaria is a huge problem, which it isn't in Western Europe, and that reduces people's ability to work, earn a living, to develop. So that may be an important issue. Natural resources, well, that brings me to the resource curse, which is shown on the slide. A lot of countries have natural resources, the benefits of which are not shared amongst the population, and which actually work against their development. And the reason is that having a lot of resources can increase the value of the country's currency and make it uneconomic for the country to try and develop industrially, so that their goods are much more expensive than goods from countries that are less well endowed with resources, and therefore the country relies solely on the export of natural resources, and the wealth from that goes to the people who have the power to exploit those natural resources, and doesn't go to development of the population at large. Now, a lot of countries that have suffered from what's called the resource curse. And then finally, there are cultural barriers. The one that's most quoted is the fact that many countries don't involve women in the workforce, or discourage women from the workforce, which means that you're halving the possibility of having good ideas, demonstrating entrepreneurship, and so on. So many cultures may discourage women from taking part, even though women might actually want to take part in economic development. And there are other cultural barriers that discourage development. So they're the theories. Why do we need these theories? Well, because the way to alter the development of path of a country must depend upon why you think the country is poor in the first place. What you think the problem to be solved is must guide you towards how you solve the problem. And the bottom line is, I think, that nowadays people think that actually it's not any one of these reasons. There are multiple reasons, there are multiple causes, and what we have to do, as Jeffrey Sachs says, is use what he calls clinical economics. That if we have a medical issue, we don't diagnose the whole population and say, you're ill, therefore you must have an antibiotic. We look at each individual case and decide what the problem is in each individual case and prescribe an appropriate cure. And that we must do that with these economic issues, bearing in mind these large-scale problems that could be at the root of issues that have prevented development in many of these countries. So in the next section, we'll go on to look at the way in which development aid has operated and the ways in which it might operate in the future.